Why does AI fundamentally change the risk profile of software development compared to traditional software development?
So it's so interesting. When Google came out, people are like, people are not going to be stupid because they don't think anymore. They just Google it.
What responsible AI red flags would you walk away from?
When you lose that customer story, you lose that human focus, and you just become, numb to the impact of the decisions you're making.
Why does that mindset usually fail once AI systems reach production?
Because we call it technical debt.
If you could leave leaders with one mindset shift they must make before responsible AI frameworks start to actually work, what would that be? Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of PureLogics Pulse, a podcast where we discuss technology, trends, product innovation, and digital transformation. I am Mohsin Ali, an APM AI here at PureLogics with 8 years of experience in everything AI. Today's episode is all about responsible and ethical AI integration in the enterprise. According to PwC's 2025 Responsible AI Survey, nearly 60% of executives believe that responsible AI directly improves ROI and operational efficiency. Yet, many organizations still struggle to implement it in practice. To explore why that gap exists, I'm joined by Steve Simmons, founder and CEO of Restyn, a company focused on delivering robust enterprise-grade solutions. Steve brings over 2 decades of industry experience, spanning data, systems, and AI. Fun fact, Steve wrote his first line of code in kindergarten. Steve, welcome to the show. Before we jump into responsible AI, I have to ask a question. As a kindergartner, how did you even end up writing your first line of code? Take us back. Feel free to share the story with us.
So the year is 1983. The computer is an Apple II, and the language is Logo. I remember, it's like you're telling a little turtle. There was a triangle on the screen, but we all believed it was a turtle. To go up, to go left, to march around, and I was just so impressed and so amazed that I could give this machine instructions and it would do what I told it to do: pen up, pen down, all this kind of stuff. And so that love kind of stuck with me, and all the way through school. Every time I got a chance to use computers or program computers, I did. I joined a computer club in middle school that where I learned basic programming. And then by high school was learning Pascal, and then Turbo Pascal, and then Delphi, and I've been through about 22 different languages at this point over the course of my career. I've been through a whole bunch of eras of computing, from prior to the internet back in the token ring networking days, to the dawn of e-commerce and Amazon and all the rest of it, and then the advent of the message queue and all of the amazing social networking sites that came out of that. And you kind of see computing evolve by like these eras of a given algorithm, right? And so, like, in the mid 20th century, we had to come up with a relational database, and what an incredible revolution that was. And then we solve every single problem in the world with a relational database, and we're trying to figure out how you're going to solve whatever it is with a relational database. And so each era is kind of defined by some seminal algorithm. I feel like right now we're in that dawn of machine learning and neural networks and all the different aggregate technologies we call artificial intelligence, or attempts at artificial intelligence. And we're trying to explore how those algorithms are going to interface with our businesses, with our lives, with our relationships, etc. But it's the same as it's always been. Like, each time we come up with a new engineering innovation, then we're like, well, how does this help humans? How does this make life better? How do we improve the quality of and support the people doing the work every day in our businesses? And so it's a fun kind of progression to be in, and to see. And I think that throughout kind of history of computing, we've had the same problem with any technical innovation, of sometimes the morals and the ethical reasoning around the technology trails, right? The trailing indicator. We figure out what we can do, and then we figure out whether we should be doing it, and how we should be doing it, and what's the proper use of it. And I think, like, if you look at some of the research coming out around the use of message queues as an algorithm in human relationships and what that does, not all of them are positive, outcomes. You look at social media and you end up with this is in theory the mechanism to connect people, and then how many people end up feeling isolated and alone and radicalized and other, non-positive human outcomes from, an algorithm being inserted into that relationship. If I was in the room with all my Facebook friends, I'd have thousands of people in a room together, and I don't know that it would be a super intimate friendship. It's more like a, hopefully I could, speak loud enough to be heard kind of thing. And I think, we look at things like that and kind of said, I look at e-commerce and say, is e-commerce a better shopping experience than walking into a retail store? And I don't think we've ever, as a avid shopper, I don't think we've ever gotten the real shopping experience into e-commerce. And so we kind of lost something of the merchandising and the look and feel and the actual touching and testing the quality of a product before you buy, that you had in physical retail. That's very hard to replicate in e-commerce. And I wonder if, AI might bring some of that back, being able to create, MCPs that would go and get much more data aggregated around a product, so you could actually, test it, pre-test it in an e-commerce environment. Any number of things like that, like thinking through the implications of what we're doing. The sooner we can do that after we discover it, the better off we are. If we let this go a decade before we think about the ethical and moral outcomes of a given technology or given algorithm, we're going to end up with sociopathic and psychopathic outcomes from it because we weren't thinking about it. And so I think it's a really important thing, that we have the conversation we're having today of just thinking through what is it that we want out of these technologies we're creating. And it's like they're great, but as an engineer, what problem am I solving?
Right. Just to add in, that's a fantastic story. Um, we've been apart by 2 decades. We've been apart at least by a decade in terms of experience, but our introduction to coding was the same. My first introduction to coding was also MS Logo. It was moving the turtle, it was rotating it around. So
I love that.
it's the starting point. I've also seen the revolution from relational databases to advanced algorithms, and I would just say the speed at which each epoch is passing by in terms of the development has grown much faster. You'd see these changes in about every 5 years, and now you're seeing it on a weekly basis. So that is a very radical change compared to what it used to be when I started, and what it used to be when you started as well.
Yeah.
Um, so coming back
But it's
to
actually with that speed is, you talk about the speed of business or whatever, and we always want to be competitive. We always be efficient and productive in these things. But I wonder sometimes if, we are getting over our ski tips, right? Like, are we moving at a pace that is still beneficial to us as human race, or is it the fear of missing out and the fear of being left behind kind of that's causing people to now make lower quality decisions just in the, service of speed? And like we always say, there's the three legs of any project. There's speed, quality, and cost. And I feel like we're often kind of being sucked into the speed as the urgency of like, oh, this is so important. And just because like it's moving quick doesn't make it the thing that we should necessarily spend all of our time and money on. And it can feel like it's really, really important. And I think Franklin Covey did a really good job of kind of laying out the quadrants. And sometimes I think we lose track of that a little bit. And so like, it's moving so fast, we better get on board or else it's going to be so far away, we're never going to catch up. Like, I think if you use it like in a kind of more meditative, way and consider what you're doing, you'll end up with better strategic outcomes, better strategic answers.
Absolutely. And that brings us very nicely into our today's discussion. If executive, you mentioned the time to market and the need to hop on every trend and every uh, recently introduced technology to incorporate that into your products. If executives believe responsible AI drives revenue and efficiency, the obvious question then is, why is responsible AI still so hard to implement in real enterprises? And you could allude to that again.
Sure. I think the biggest obstacle really to the adoption of AI is the lack of understanding of what we mean. So we have a buzzword and it sounds really special. And we've seen movies since, the beginning of movies about the idea of artificial intelligence, of something that is human-like, that is human-esque, that can do human tasks. And I mean, you think of Lost in Space, and the robot is, one of the biggest characters, right? We love that robot. The telling ourselves the story of this humanity, the story we've been telling about AI. And I think a lot of executives get that like bulk of the narrative that has been AI for 100 years, confused with the technology and the algorithms that are being brought to market right now. And So I think it's important that the decision makers be educated. Kind of like in medicine, we require informed consent, right? You have to a doctor may know way more than you do about your body on any number of fronts, but he has to explain it to you so you can understand the consequences of the decision you're making, so you can make an informed decision about whether or not you want to take given medical treatment or not. I think it's really important that as technologists, as developers, we bring in the understanding of what AI actually is to the business owners, stakeholders, and decision makers in our businesses. I think of like in software development, you look at the code completion tools prior to AI, and they're like very basic list lookups, right? And they aren't particularly useful. They're great. They're better than nothing, right? When we got IDEs, that was so much better than command line because you had the augmenting tools that made a developer more efficient because maybe you didn't remember the name of every function or what the arguments were in the function kind of thing. But it was kind of limited in scope. AI expanded that scope, made it so the code completion tools that are now available to the developer are so much better than they used to be. What an incredible thing. But it's also a little bit non-deterministic in its creation. So sometimes it'll suggest things the developer looks at and goes, like, that's not even the right name of the variable. Like, it'd be cool that I have variables that look like that. That's not the variable I'm using, or whatever it is. And so you still need the judgment, the design, the architecture, the plan, and the rule set being set by human judgment. But that same developer is now kind of got this pair programmer in his code completion tool, where it used to take like extreme programming, you'd have two developers looking at the same screen in order to get that kind of efficiency. Now you can pair up the code completion tools that are available through AI with a human developer and get great outcomes. Can you remove the human developer from the equation and end up with a secure, stable, scalable platform? No, absolutely not. And I don't see that happening anytime soon. I'm happy to be proved wrong if I am, but I look at that and go, if you look at the fundamental algorithms that are being put out there, they aren't judgment algorithms, right? They're aggregation algorithms, they're synthesis algorithms, they're next best character algorithms, which are all like phenomenal at saying, go do the research and speed up my ability to do research. So now developers spending less time doing research, more time writing code. That's amazing. What a huge productivity gain. Am I looking to replace a developer with the next vibe coding tool that comes off the shelf? No, I'm not. And I think that that's the place in understanding. Same thing, like if you look at like a financial analyst, right? And they're trying to read through all the 10K filings for every company in America. That's going to take a really long time. With AI, you can speed that up dramatically. Can you replace the judgment of a CFP? I don't think so, right? And so it's that pair programming concept. It's the augmenting and investing in and empowering people with better tools to get better insight, to have more information available to them in a more consolidated fashion that these algorithms are great at providing. If executives understand that, they're going to make better decisions on how to bring this into their companies to get an actual ROI. I think that when we look at some of the research that's coming out where companies are struggling to get a return on investment, I think that struggle in the return on investment is because they set a goal or a task for AI as a generic tagline that AI was never going to deliver against. And so they end up kind of in a failed implementation because they're like, well, it's artificial intelligence. It can do what a human could do, can't it? And you're like, well, it could do certain things that a human can do in a certain way, in a certain pattern. But I think that's kind of where it comes down. And when I look at it, I feel like in my analysis of it, the Turing test is at fault. So we came up with this as trying to come up with an objective test to measure the effectiveness of an artificial intelligence. And basically the Turing test says if a human can't tell the difference between what the machine is turning out and what a human is turning out, then we've achieved artificial intelligence. And so all the AI models are all kind of chasing that same flag of making so when they say something, the human accepts it as coming from a human. And it's kind of a terrible measure because that means that how much time you look at it, but like they're going to be biased to tell you that you're smart and beautiful and amazing and incredible and that you made a really wise choice because the human brain is gamed, right, to think, oh well, this is a really smart person if he thinks I'm smart and this is a really great idea. It says that I had a good idea, right? And so it's easy to pass the Turing test and not end up with a high quality result. Whereas it would be better if you had a more like flatline, less emotional manipulation and just kind of straightforward. Here are the sources that we drew from. Here's the conclusions we drew because of it. Like show me the tree that got me to that solution, right? Like we did research on the web and we found these 16 websites, these 6 sources. Why is it that right now, if I ask for the sources, sometimes AI will even fabricate the source that it got the information from, right? And it's like that's not a service to anybody. And so we know that these models are trained on vast amounts of information. Wouldn't it be cool if the human users were able to get insight into how AI arrived at whatever conclusion they drew, so they could evaluate the quality of the answers it's getting?
Right. Uh, Perfect. Let me just encapsulate this whole conversation with a question. You and I, as developers, understand the role of AI, the importance of oversight, the inner workings of the AI model. But most of the organizations are built up with a section of developers and a section of non-developers. And some of those non-developers are in strategic decision-making positions. Um, so is the challenge for them more technical, cultural, or just organizational?
That there's a technical obstacle that needs to be acknowledged. And the example I think of when you look at the epochs of computing was for a long time, we were looking for 4GL, right? The fourth generation language. And the idea of the 4GL was we were going to give this to an executive, and now they were going to be able to interact directly with the machine without needing a developer, because developers, like, we don't want developers. And they're expensive and it takes a long time to train them and stuff. We need a 4GL. And like SQL was one of those languages, right? You can't, you know, create security flaws or other, like it's a really constrained sandbox where you're just using basic linear algebra principles and other things that most executives should know in order to write basic, like, human written. It says things like select and, words that I understand, and I can name the columns, things that I understand. Like, this is something any executive should be able to do. And what we discovered was that, executives took 30 seconds, looked at it, and went, that's really cool. You can solve a lot of stuff with that. Let's hire somebody to do that for me because I don't feel like doing it. Right. Crystal Reports, same thing. Like, it's a reporting tool. Any executive, any non-technical user could use Crystal Reports to create reports. Did they? I mean, maybe sometimes, but most of the time you got a Crystal Reports developer or a database guy to come in and do it for you, because just the thought processes that go into structured data and understanding, how to do joins and what the process is in order to get the answer that I want from it and understand whether or not I got the answer I wanted. Like, how many reports are there in the world where a non-technical user created a report and understand the information, put two things together that don't actually go together and end up with a result that looked relevant, but didn't actually have to do with what they said it had to do with. And I think it happens all the time. And you're seeing it with AI right now, where the story told by the creators of AI is that any non-technical user can now write an app or can now go do a technical task they couldn't do before. We're going to empower people to do things they couldn't do before. And the problem is that people who don't think in that developer mindset, who don't come with an architectural view, we saw this a little bit in Agile. When Agile came out, we said developers now make it so that architects and designers are unnecessary because developers can do everything. And design thinking kind of quickly followed, because they're like, actually, there are things that developers are really good at, but they get tunneled into the trees and forget the forest. And sometimes you got to remember the forest. And so we got to balance that pattern out. Same thing between business and technology, right? The connection of the business process we want to put into technology, both sides need to understand each other, right? The business needs to understand enough about the technology to understand what to ask for in a way that will be delivered, and the technologists need to know enough about the business to put that into play in a way that's going to meet the needs of the actual business rather than dragging them off somewhere else. And I think that's every single IT project ever, is somebody who doesn't know the technology very well but needs to know enough to say, here's the requirement, talking to somebody who knows the technology really well but needs to understand a little bit more about the business, coming together and saying, all right, how are we going to solve this problem and get it so we get a mutually beneficial solution. And I think that's the same here with AI. I think the risk is there's so many people who are just saying, we need AI, adopt it really quickly, put it everywhere, use it for everything, and that's what other people are doing, so that's what I need to do. And the fact is, other people aren't really, doing that. Everybody's trying to figure out. We're all in the same, mess. It's moving fast for every single person doing it. And obviously, the bigger corporations that have bigger teams against it are going to move faster than the smaller companies that have less, team to move against it. But the problem is similar. Of saying, I like to say, it's funny we call it computer science. It's really computer art, because there's a huge difference between Leonardo da Vinci and paint by number. And if you use technology like paint by number, you end up with paint by number kind of looking art. And if you get Da Vinci to go do it for you, you end up with like masterpieces. And it's the same thing in software. Like you can have something that functionally gets to an endpoint and technically does what it does, but doesn't do it in a beautiful fashion, may not do it in a secure fashion, may not do it in a stable fashion, may not do it in a scalable fashion, but like it technically, you put the information in the form and it ends up in the database. So I guess you achieve something. And I think that's the kind of level we are with AI. A lot of people are like, well, we decided we were going to replace our knowledge base with AI. I'm like, that's a good use case. There's a great opportunity to take what used to be like a basic, text search and turn it into an AI search of your entire, knowledge store, right? So you have all these documents people have written over the years, all these project plans people have done over the years, and you want to say, how do we usually do a project plan? Go look at this, cloud storage device that has all of our old project plans on it. It'll tell you over time, we used to do it this way, now we do it this way. You might want to think about this. Great use of AI. If you put that in a non-technical hand, are they going to be able to ensure that that's going to consistently do that? That's going to authoritatively do that? That's a good question. And I think it's kind of unfair to ask non-technical, non-developer, non-architectural thinking people to be responsible to ensure that the algorithms they're putting in place are being used responsibly or are doing what they're being asked to do, because it is a certain level of technical competence required to drive this machine, just like every other machine that we've ever created.
That is such a good example. The paint by numbers versus Da Vinci painting you or writing you code. That's something I'd love to use in my conversations as well. Um, we have to realize the importance of these frameworks as well. Like you said, it's like painting by numbers. And you paint by numbers when you're not as competent or as proficient at painting as Da Vinci is, right? So it's a very important step or a protocol for non technical professionals aiming to have an understanding of the technical processes to use these sort of frameworks. And I'd love to talk about this. Many organizations treat responsible AI adoption as a checklist item on a compliance task rather than an operating mindset. Why do you think companies struggle to treat responsibility the same way as they treat reliability or security, let's say?
So it's really interesting if you look at like cybersecurity as a practice, as an example. And is cybersecurity a endpoint? Like I want to get to cybersecurity and I've arrived. I'm now cyber secure. Or is it a process? There's all these checkboxes we have to check in all sorts of different aspects of our business in order to ensure that we're still cyber secure. Or is it built architecturally into how we frame our system and frame the platform we use? And the answer is it's basically all of them, right? So if I think about how to create a secure operating environment, I need technical controls in place. I need human controls in place. I need education and training in place. I need there to be shared knowledge about best practices that continues to evolve because the threats continue to evolve. And I think it's the same thing with the responsible use. If you turn it into a compliance task, which it should be, right? So somebody in compliance should be looking and saying, are we still paying attention to this? Is this still something important to us? It should be on every checklist, right? If we're going to use AI, have we thought about the consequences? And if you look at in like the financial services space, the SEC has released some draft guidance now kind of saying, we really need to be thinking intentionally about what this means to the guarantees we made to investors that we're going to protect their best interest. And so if an advisor is going to use our artificial intelligence in their study and their research and their creation of a recommendation and their analysis of the data, like what are the impacts, what are the vulnerabilities, what are the risks that we come into the process because of that? And I think it's a great example of saying this is every aspect of the business needs to be invested, or else you are opening yourself up to vulnerabilities that you haven't even considered. And so if you're going to adopt it, you can't just say, well, it's some compliance guy's job to check the box and say, did we ask Joe whether or not he did it? Oh, good. He did. Okay. Well, then check. And I think like, if you look at once again, in that cybersecurity as an example, the SEC's original, stuff was if an advisor could attest to the fact that all their stuff was cyber secure, SEC took that because in the early days, like, if you got antivirus, it was thought that was kind of the protection you needed. And so great, we did that. And so you'd have a letter every year to the SEC saying, oh, well, we attest that we did everything good, right? Now they're looking at it and going, we need to actually come up with a list of controls that says, do you have these controls in place? Do you have this training in place? Do you have these processes in place? Are you using these kinds of systems? Are you using these kind of, tools? Like Joe Biden put out an executive order saying all federal agencies need to adopt zero trust. right? And zero trust is a completely different security model than had ever been used before. But it was kind of looking at the threat coming and saying, we need to start thinking about this at every level. So your systems need to be able to identify who's using them and whether or not they're authorized to use them, what kind of data they're allowed to use, what kind of features they're allowed to use, what kind of applications they're allowed to use, like all these things that before we were kind of like, oh, just it'll be great. We put a big ring fence around the company, and anything happens outside the company, it's fine. I mean, we got a big wall around it. Like, who cares what happens inside? It's all safe. It's all people we trust. Well, how's that handle insider threats? I don't know. But, how does that handle the data leakage? Not sure, right? But if the ring fence is strong enough and zero trust, that actually don't trust any machine by default. You might have ransomware somewhere in your network. How are you cutting that off and isolating that? Can you do microsegmentation in order to get down to, like, and it's the same thing in AI. If you think about, well, how are you using AI as a user? How are you using AI as a developer? How are you using AI in your applications? They all have different risks, and we should be looking at those risks and saying, what is the risk reward and what's our risk appetite, and doing the same kind of compliance analysis you do on any other technology. If you're going to put a laptop in the hands of somebody, like, what tools you're putting in place to make sure that laptop doesn't become a threat to your business. Same thing with AI. Same thing with any other vendor management process. How do they handle data? How do they store data? How do they transmit data? How do they encrypt data? How do they protect the privacy of that data? What third parties have access to the data because you're interacting with it? Like, they're all good checklist questions, but it has to be more than a checklist in order to be an effective program. And so, to have responsible use of AI, you need to have people understand technically what's going on. You need to have people understand legally what's going on from a contextual business process point of view, what's going on from a human management point of view. And there's a collaboration that has to happen in order to end up with the outcome being a positive, return for your business.
Absolutely. And that's such an important point. If you don't have people or key decision makers at each of these nodes, you'd have gaps. And a friend of mine suggested this great analogy. uh, that person said that whenever you have a product or an image, let's say, and there are gaps in the image, when you scale that up or you expand that, those gaps become massive. And if you leave gaps in your MVP, they're bound to show up in your production system. So, just talking about this operational shift, the shift of mindset to being cognizant of these checkpoints, let's talk about incentives and behaviors to bridge the gap between the management side of things and the development side of things. As a former developer yourself, could you comment on to what incentives or pressures uh, prevent you or enable you um, from embedding responsible AI into your daily work?
I always think about sales as you're setting up the expectations going to live with something for a lifetime. Right. And so the story you tell to convince someone to do something is how you're going to be forced to interact with that thing for a very long time, unless you resell it, basically. And so when people are looking at AI and saying the primary thing about AI is it's cheaper than a human. And so I'm going to try with all my might to use that incentive of it's cheaper to replace a human with AI. You end up with a certain kind of thing. When you have people saying, AI is faster than you, and so we want to do it that way. When you say AI is more accurate than people for a given thing, you end up boxed in. And so I think you want to think very carefully around the expectations you set, the narratives you tell, and have that come from a informed, knowledgeable place of saying, what do we actually want? And I think that that's often something that, in the fear of missing out and the being left behind, that often is lost, is the decision making about who is the customer, what is the business process, and what is the business model. I love Jim Collins wrote Good to Great. It was a great book about business leadership, but he talked about finding the flywheel in your business, which was the actual business process that actually made you profitable and gave you a value proposition in the marketplace. And some of the businesses he used in there were like Circuit City and Fannie Mae, and these businesses that went bankrupt and died. And Fannie Mae didn't die, but it struggled. And so he wrote another book called Why the Mighty Fall, Why Some Companies Never Give In, analyzing his good to great examples that failed. And it's a brilliant look at whether do you actually understand your business. So, like the example of Circuit City, Circuit City was an incredible electronics retailer because it had the most knowledgeable, informed salespeople in the market. You went to Circuit City and you got like the the people who are fully embedded in like the audio files and the computer geeks and whatever it was, they were really, really knowledgeable salespeople. And so you would go and you'd get actual recommendations and help them. It would help you actually navigate um, the field. And they were competing against, Best Buy and other likes that had much more junior salespeople who were, reading the label faster than you were and could kind of walk you through the aisles and help you out, but not at the same level that the super senior. Problem was the super senior salespeople. So Jim Collins in his book, Why the Mighty Fall and Why Stock Companies Never Give In, reflected on the fact that Circuit City, when it got to a point of struggle and in its life cycle, the executives looked and not understanding what made the company great, said, the most expensive thing in this whole company is this sales team. The sales team is crazy expensive. And so they let their senior salespeople go and replace them with junior minimum wage workers. And that was the end of Circuit City. Because at that point, they had no differentiation in the marketplace. They had some financial structures with their suppliers that made it problematic. So they were debt loaded and other things that ultimately caused the fail. But the turning point was when they lost track of what made them great. What was the value they brought to the table? And I think it's the same thing that we risk today as executives all over the country is, do you know the value proposition that your people bring to your table? Do you understand what each, role in your company does, what each, person brings, the jungle knowledge they've got, the domain knowledge they've got, the customer understanding they got, the relationships they've got, like all the uniquely human things they bring to the table. And, can you see technology as a way to support, to invest in, and to upskill, to bring more power to those people? And doesn't that sound like a better thesis than how can I shrink my company and remove the unique value that each of those team members brings? And I think that's kind of the decision point we're sitting at. A lot of things, there are definitely human roles that will continue to evolve and continue to shift, and that nobody wants to sit and do manually retyping cut and paste every day. It was a revolution when we got cut and paste. That's amazing, right? It's the same thing now. This is an incredible tool. Are we using it responsibly? Are we using it well? Are we using it to do what it does really well? And are we using it to empower people? And I think that's the thing that we need to build our reasoning around, is saying everything we're doing, the human is a customer, right? The customer is always human. The impact is always human. The legacy is always human. The value and the quality of what we're doing always ends up in a human hand. So if you're looking at it from that point of view, how can you make it so the lives of the people that work for you, with you, and that you work for, how are those human lives better as a result of the engineering you did? And if you can answer that question and end up with saying, no, the lives of everybody using this are better. And I think about databases made it easier for everybody to have a shared view of the truth. What an incredible revolution it is to be able to have sales and operations looking at the same picture of the company. Wow, that's a revolution, right? You could have lifetime real data feeds for pricing. In retail, what an incredible thing that is. We're at the same epoch, but it's just another evolution of the same story. And so when we think about it, we don't want to get kind of silver bullet thinking, which is what oftentimes less technical executives end up with, of like, I'm going to take this CRM because CRM is the best CRM in the world. It's going to solve all my company's problems, and my sales team is going to be magically more productive because I got the #1 CRM in the world. I'm like, well, look at the statistics on any CRM, and you'll see that user adoption is a challenge in CRMs because salespeople don't like doing data entry. So what value are you bringing to that salesperson? How are you empowering that salesperson? How are you making their life easier? How are you giving them a tool set that makes it so that they're more productive, they're making more money, their commissions are higher because they used your tool? And if you can solve that problem, then all of a sudden you're going to have great user adoption and you're going to have a huge impact in the business. If you just see it as, we need to do data entry because executives need to have a report at the end of the day that says what you did, the likelihood that gets kind of user adoption, the kind of impact your company you want, is going to be much, much less. And so it's the same thing here. If rather than seeing every new algorithm as a way to undercut or detract from or remove people, if we say there's going to be a natural shift in people's roles and responsibilities, for sure, right? But the people carry immense value in this enterprise, and so we want to hold on to and invest in and build those people. And if you think about what AI is good at, you would think AI would be being used a lot more for workforce development and for training and for education and for research and for development of humans, so that we, people have observed, well, AI is kind of the same as an entry-level employee today, and so you can replace entry-level employees. I'm like, if you think about that in even a 3 to 5 year window, That's a terrible idea. If you remove your entry-level workforce, in 3 to 5 years, you're not going to have a mid-level workforce. If you remove your mid-level workforce, in 3 to 5 years, you're not going to have a senior workforce. Like it's not a hard computation to look a little bit longer than 1 quarter and go, this is a terrible idea. What are we doing? If instead you say, I can accelerate someone through their workforce development, so that now rather than 3 to 5 years to get from entry level to mid and from mid to senior, it's now 1 to 2 years. And so I'm able to upskill a workforce and have a much more senior, much more capable, much more functional workforce much faster. How much more productivity, how much more effectiveness, how many more relationships, how many more customers can we support because we use this tool where it should be in order to accelerate, our business. And I think that's the kind of thing that leads to better outcomes for folks.
Fantastic. That was perfectly articulated. You touched on two very key points. First, as a developer and the executive relationship, the executives decide on a metric that you want to boost your productivity by X amount, or you want to replace such and such tasks or delegate such and such tasks to AI completely. And then the responsibility is pushed down onto the process owners themselves. What changes when that responsibility is owned at the executive level rather than pushed down to the teams that are acting on it?
So executives, I've done executive coaching for years for people who are right on that brink. They've been individual contributors and they want to break in. And it's so interesting to think about what is different between individual contributor and exec. And an exec is someone who wants to be measured on the performance of the people they empower, whereas an individual contributor wants to be measured on their own performance. And so if you think about that, and the exec is looking at everything in their field of view as things that they can, if I invest in this, whether it's a person or a platform or an application or a system, whatever it is, a process, you think about the adoption of Six Sigma as a process and how many companies were revolutionized by that. Executives looked at it and they said, if I invest in this, can I get a return? Is this something I want to be in front of? Is this something I want to tie my name to? Is this something I want to, have an impact and legacy with? Is this something where I'm going to serve my people and serve my customer better because of? And so the excitement that is around AI right now comes from that, assessment. And I think the thing that hasn't been fully vetted yet is the appropriate and accurate education of that executive on the tool that and the investment that's sitting in front of them. And so I think right now, if the FTC was really serious, that they would kind of challenge some of the claims that are being made as like false advertising claims, because I think that it is obstructive to the productive use of AI to tell these wild stories about what it's capable of when we know technically what it can do.
Absolutely, and that's been such a challenge for the developers in this day and age when they're being compared to the productivity metrics of AI, but then they're being held responsible to the quality standards of traditional software development. To this point, I would love to ask you, why does AI fundamentally change the risk profile of software development compared to traditional software development?
So it's so interesting. In when Google came out, people are like, people are not going to be stupid because they don't think anymore. They just Google it, right? And the same story is being told right now. Well, the problem with AI is that people are just going to become stupid. I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Idiocracy, but I love that movie. It's great. Dax Shepard's brilliant. And it is certainly a dystopian future that we could make it to, right? And I think about, there's been research done about taking notes in college. And if you take handwritten notes, your brain stores the information far better than if you take typewritten notes, because the physical process of writing the language interacts with the human brain really effectively to get the human brain to learn. And so you remember and you would process better and you do better on exams, and you have better recall years later of the stuff you did where you took physical notes. So all these technologies came and said, hey kids, you can record the class instead so you don't have to take notes, is actually a detriment to the human process of learning. And so the kids who are recording, if they go back and just use that because they can't write fast enough, so they take that recording, they actually then work and do the work to get the notes, they're going to learn. But they do that recording thinking, well, I have it if I need it, but then they just kind of try to fake it through the exam. They aren't getting as much domain knowledge out of that experience as they would otherwise. And I think the same thing with AI is, AI allows you to get over your ski tips in ways that you aren't fully aware that you're over your ski tips until you're like, I don't know how to solve this problem, and it's done things that I don't fully understand. And now trying to debug this is really challenging because I didn't really write it in the first place. If that's where you are, you're using AI wrong, right? And so every time you're interacting with it, um, it's something where it's kind of like it's writing the first draft, and then you're using that to upskill, to learn, to dig deeper, to go further. And it should be speeding up that process for you, but we shouldn't lose the importance of the time it takes to actually improve the quality of the human contributors to that process. And so if it's just a crutch you're sitting on to try to be, more skilled than you are, and you never learn the things that it's doing for you, I think that's ultimately kind of a dead end road. If you're using it to, accelerate your research so you can learn how to do more and do it faster, great. And I think the implicit risks are things where the algorithms are designed to create things that appear non-deterministic. And because they're designed to appear non-deterministic, I think it was Aaron Levy, the CEO of Box, was like, this is not replacing deterministic software. Like, I don't want a creative ERP system. Like, if I add up all these numbers, they should still add up to their sum, right? The end. I don't need it could be, I don't need a hallucination about my bottom line, right? I need a database that's going to do the sum appropriately and deterministically, and out we go. But if I want, to put that in context, to do benchmarks and standards and other things to measure against industry and other things that are more qualitative, AI might have a really great role there. So I'm not going to replace my accountants with AI, but I might give insight to my FP&A people with AI. And I think that's the kind of thinking we need to be doing, is saying, understand that all value ultimately is human. And so if your AI solutions are removing the ability for a human to grow in quality, grow in knowledge, grow in capability, grow in skill, ultimately that's a dead end road. If instead this tool is amplifying and accelerating the development of your human workforce, the development of your service, then I think you're probably on the right path, because they are great tools. Like I said, the code completion tools available to developers today are part on the best that have ever existed in the history of computing. And if you realize the value of a human developer to bring that ingenuity, that creativity, that novel problem solving and solutioning to the table, and you give them a tool to be more efficient and more effective at remembering the free libraries and frameworks or whatever they should be using to solve this, and well, actually there's a new version of that one, have you paid attention to, like, you should be using this version instead of that version. Oh, cool, great, right? Like, all that kind of stuff is great, but it's not great if we now are getting a human outside of their competence zone, and so they are now becoming less and less competent in operating that machine, because ultimately that machine is not going to be able to replace their human judgment. So their human judgment has to be brought along for the journey.
Stephen, that answer has been a gold mine of insights for me. You've articulated a concept beautifully, more beautifully than I've ever had it articulated before. You talked about the respecting and recognizing the dystopian frameworks that are in our mind, and respecting the processes that get us to learn things, that get us to develop proficiency in the first place. We need to recognize that all of the value at the end, all of the derivatives at the end, are human oriented. And with that sentence, you've described it more beautifully than I've ever had it described to me before. Thank you for that. Um, an interesting question. Seeing as you're an expert in development and strategic decision making both, if you were evaluating an AI startup today, what responsible AI red flags would you walk away from? Or even if the technology itself was impressive, what would turn you off?
I think the biggest red flag is signs of sociopathy and signs of psychopathy. So when people are not evaluating the human impact of their decisions, when technology is not evaluating the impact in human relationships, when people don't understand who their customer really is and who they're serving. And I think about, like, you ever watch Social Network, the story of the founder of Facebook? I don't know how accurate that movie is, but I thought it did a really good job of crystallizing Mark Zuckerberg's struggle of trying to find a customer. And he knew somewhere down, he called it being cool in that movie. I don't know if that's how it actually worked or not, but But I thought it was a really good thing of like Facebook had a cool factor when it really was serving its people, right? When it was just the users of Facebook were the customer, and before they got advertising, before they got big revenue centers that are disconnected and third party to the end user. And fundamentally today, Facebook, their customer is the advertiser, their customer is the corporation, their customer is not the end user, right? I'm not the customer of Facebook. And so when you lose that customer story, when you lose that human focus, and you just become, numb to the impact of the decisions you're making, I think that's the biggest red flag of like, um, there are a lot of things we can do that aren't necessarily productive or beneficial. And so, are the founders, are the technologists, are the engineers focused on doing things that are of benefit, are of value, that have an increase in the quality of life for the person using it? And I say the same thing in boardrooms all the time. You want to revolutionize your business. Um, Stop looking at the people in your business as cogs. Stop looking at them as a job description or as a role. And we always say, it's not personal, it's business. But the fact is, the businesses that really excel are the people who unlock the personal value, the individual, unique character value of every single person in that business. And they aren't just an accountant. They aren't just a developer. They're a creative, incredible, ingenious, contributor who has more to offer every single time than companies ever are able to leverage. And when we understand that, and we say, how can we get technology to amplify and accelerate the amount that we are able to leverage the incredible intrinsic value of every human member of that team, all of a sudden you unleash a force multiplying effect in that company that you didn't even know was there. Like we had acquired this team and we built this business in order to do this thing. And you think about in mergers and acquisitions, how many times does the acquirer buy a team because of engineering competence or whatever, and then manage in such a fashion that they have engineering flight? And it happens all the time. It's so commonplace where some big multinational will buy some smaller company in order to get their engineering team. That engineering team doesn't want to work for a multinational. They get into it and they're like, oh, this is terrible. And one by one, they all flee. And then what did the acquirer end up with at the end of the day? And I think it's the same thing anytime you're doing technology adoption or doing any project of, um, there's an old saying that people don't join companies or leave companies, they join managers or leave managers. And it's kind of true. Like at the end of the day, we're looking for somewhere we belong. We're looking for somewhere where we're appreciated, where we're accepted, where we're known, where we're valued, where the things that we're passionate about are brought to the fore and allowed to be make a difference in the world. And so everybody at some level has this unique thing that isn't just their job description, it isn't just their role. And I think AI, personalized medicine, other modern technologies are starting to see that and say, how can we use technology to really unlock the value of every single individual human across the human race? I mean, we've got billions of people on Earth, and every single one of them is unique. What an incredible thing! How would you assemble a team? How would you manage a team? How would you measure a team? How would you look at performance of a team if you weren't just looking at job descriptions? You were instead looking at the individuals that make it up.
Phenomenal. Um, that is very beautifully articulated. I think it's very important to understand the value or the unique value proposition of every single contributor as opposed to just recognizing the value that a system adds. That's very well articulated. Um, can I ask you about um, the "we'll fix it later" mindset? Uh, because the advent of AI has enabled quicker development and quicker time to market. Why does that mindset usually fail once AI systems reach production?
Because we call it technical debt. And we called it technical debt for a very long time. And before AI, everybody knew the challenges of technical debt. If you look at the analysis that's been done between waterfall projects and AI projects, and the advantages and disadvantages of both, one isn't necessarily empirically better than the other, but Agile operates far more on the management of technical debt, and waterfall attempts to avoid technical debt from the get-go. Both end up with technical debt, so it's not like one is empirically like perfect, the other one's not. But if you think about designing a process that's going to end up with quality, speed and cost being optimized, you're never going to make a decision to say we want 100% quality, and money doesn't matter and time doesn't matter. I mean, you'd never release a product, right? So there's always pressure from the market to get something to market, to do something. And an 80% solution is oftentimes phenomenal and something you can operate on for years before needing to get to the 90% solution or the 100% solution. And in a lot of ways, no good business should ever think there is such a thing as a 100% solution, or else, we're not going to continue to grow, develop, improve, innovate, disrupt, etc. So, when we imagine our ideals as a human, and we kind of put out these goals that are our big, hairy, audacious goals, or whatever the design plan is, um, we should know that there's, objectively more than we can see right now, right? We're working in the fog of war, we're working in the obscurity of the marketplace, however you want to put it, and so the to not introduce intentional flaws is important, but to try to avoid all flaws is an obstruction to progress. And so I think that the problem we have right now, like I said, is the um, separation between what AI actually does and what the decision makers are asking it to do. And that's been time immemorial always the problem between business and technology, right? The business wants it to do this. The technologist says, we can probably do that, does something different, brings it back, and the business is like, well, that's not what I asked for. CIO magazine used to run a report, I don't know if they're still doing it, of how many IT projects fail every year. And it's always, the majority, right? And then what's the definition of an IT project failing? Well, it's because the cost and the time and the, expectations weren't met as originally imagined. And one of the great advantages of Agile was it kind of said, hey guys, let's realize that whatever we're doing, if you're investing in technology, it's going to be continuously changing from now forever. You're choosing to invest in a road where you're going to continuously invest, you're going to continuously change, you're going to continuously evolve. The market demands are going to change, the requirements are going to change. There's always going to be scope creep. It's not actually scope creep. It's that the scope is actually shifting under our feet. And so when we think about it that way instead, what decisions would you make? So AI is introducing intentional flaws that we know about. So why would we rely on AI to do things where we know that there should be a human process governing the decision making? So if we there are commercially reasonable ways to mitigate those threats by making sure that the human developers are the ones making the ultimate judgment calls, and technology is simply augmenting them. So I think that's the place where we are right now is one of the best defenses we've got is not getting ahead of ourselves, not saying you can do something you can't do. Let's educate our stakeholders so they understand that, so that we can get the investment, because it does take investment to use these new tools. They aren't cheap. Even OpenAI just came out and said they aren't making money on their $200 a month plan. Like it's an expensive thing to do, and so to get an ROI on that, let's make sure we're using it in a way that it can perform against the expectations we're setting for it.
So, closing with executive reflection. If you could leave leaders with one mindset shift they must make before responsible AI frameworks start to actually work, what would that be?
I think the biggest lesson for leaders to learn is to not make fear-based decisions. So the amygdala basically has two signals it can send the brain, and one is the classic Wall Street greed or opportunity, and the other is fear, which is also survival. And I think that we when we operate out of fear, the quality of our decisions have been shown to be lower. So there were studies done on, I think it was sugar plantations, and people operating sugar plantations, and they have a very strong cash cycle, and that once a year you would get all the revenue for the entire year, and then you burn it down to the end. And so your decisions that you make throughout the year are going to determine your success, of whether or not you get the crop, and whether or not you make money again, and whether or not you have the money to reseed to go next year or whatever. And they watch the quality of decision making. And as you get closer and closer to the end of the year, when you have more and more pressure because you have less and less cash and more risk on the table, the quality of the human decision making went down. And so being able to manage that and see that for what it is, and understand that all the noise and the hubbub and the fat around you, and people yelling at you saying you're going to be left behind and your business is not going to whatever, acknowledge that as an input and be like, all right, that's great, that's good information to have, I'm glad that that's there. But the decision needs to come from a place of the strategic understanding. And the human beings are the apex predator on Earth, and have been the apex predator on Earth, not because we're the fastest, not because we're the strongest, but because we manage risk better than any other species on Earth. And so if you look at this, having that risk management mindset, understanding the cost benefit analysis, understanding the intentional investment you're making and the return you're expecting from it, and holding yourself accountable to that, so that if you see it shifting, you don't continue to putting good money after bad, are all things where either the strong greed signal or the strong fear signal are both gonna, obscure your ability to walk right through the message you're getting from the amygdala and get to a strong, solution, like a neocortex solution, something that differentiates us from, other species. And I think that's the thing that leaders are always challenged with is you're making decisions that are life and death decisions. It's people's jobs on the line. It's people's well-being on the line, for yourself, for your customers, for your team members. They're big, important decisions. We shouldn't discount them and say, "Oh no, these are like meaningless." No, these are huge decisions that are being made. But when we get dragged into the fear, our decision making quality goes down. And so, look at the field, learn the field, understand the field, and hold on to those core values, those core beliefs that got you where you were going. Right, if Circuit City had held on to its high quality salespeople, maybe it would still be here today because that was the value brought to the marketplace and people loved them for it. And I think that's the thing of saying, like, what is truly valuable at the end of the day? Who really is your customer? Who are you serving? Like, what is the unique individual, capabilities that each member of your team brings to the table? What are you capable of performing? What is this technology capable of contributing? And when I stay in that realm of kind of less noise, I'm going to make higher quality decisions that are going to end up with a higher return, a better fiscal outcome, a better human impact. And so there's a lot of fear and a lot of greed running around in the messaging right now around AI of either going to miss out or else it's going to replace everybody, or it's all existential threat, or nobody's going to have a job in 10 years. And all those messages are just noise. And so if we as a human race decide that we want to make the quality of life better for ourselves and our posterity, we can still do that. We are still in the position of having wisdom and insight and judgment and leadership to go and invest in each other intentionally, build community intentionally, build, a world that we want to live in and continue to live in, and use everything that we've got, all of our ingenuity, all of our creativity, all of the technology we've built in order to achieve that goal. And so if we can, set aside the sociopathy and the psychopathy and the other like just distracting things and set down the fear and the greed, like raw signals, and instead look for the impact we want to have and the relationships we want to build and the outcomes we want to achieve, we're going to end up with a far better future for ourselves, for our businesses, and for the people we love.
That's sage advice. Whenever I usually ask these questions to technical experts, it's usually very hard to get out of the technical jargon. I really appreciate how you've made it into such a palatable format. Um, Thank you so much for your time. This has been a gold mine of insights for me, Steve. Usually it's very difficult to hear your voice again, but I'll be tuning into this episode again. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me.